We've had a series of disastrous education ministers, knowing very little about it, but wielding enormous power. I mean, take this whole question of testing, which most teachers absolutely detest. I mean, it prevents you from developing what the real purpose of education, to help them expand their minds, to arouse their curiosity. The former Conservative education minister came, and he said, the purpose of education is to make you employable, full stop. Now, I ask you, of course a well-educated person will be employable, and how? But that's not the only purpose of education. So you introduce state secondary education just in order to have efficient cogs in the wheel. Now, is that really what we're educating our children, just to be efficient cogs in a wheel? Or what about teaching them that if they don't like the shape of the wheel, they can change it?
Can you tell us, first of all, what your name is and how old you are and when you were born?
Well, my name is Len Goldman, normally referred to as Len. I was born on August the 7th, 1916, in the middle of the First World War, at a place called Stourport, officially part of Kidderminster, on the River Stour. We stayed there for a short while, but after that we went down to Weston-super-Mare. When the war was over, we went to Brighton.
Okay, so you were born in the Midlands.
Yes.
You moved to Weston-super-Mare in the West Country.
That's right.
And then you moved to Brighton. So how old were you when you moved to Brighton?
Somewhere between 4 and 5, because I remember shortly after we got here I started school, so it must have been round about 5.
Okay.
Which would be 1921, of course.
Yes. And what about your parents? What did your parents do?
Well, my mother was one of the millions of Jewish refugees fleeing Tsarist persecution at the beginning of the 20th century, and so were my father's parents. He was born in England, but his parents were born in a similar place to my mother. He ran a small business of his own, and my mother devoted the whole of her life to her 4 children. And really, looking back, I believe, sacrificed a great deal. I think she was very talented, but never really developed her talents.
So that was quite common, wasn't it?
It was indeed.
Of women that
was indeed.
Very intelligent, bright women, but the home and the children came
absolutely,
first, yeah.
Yes.
So, tell us something about your family life. You said you had
three sisters.
Right.
3 sisters, and being the boy, you might think I was favoured. Just the opposite. I got a lot of backhanded favours. For instance, if I was quarrelling with my sisters, my mother would say, "Oh, leave them alone, they're only girls." Now, of course, that's denigrating the girls, nonetheless telling me to shut up.
I'm sure they didn't put up with any nonsense from
those
girls. Yeah. So you moved to Brighton. The family moved when you were about 4 or 5.
Yes.
And did you spend your entire education in Brighton? Were you educated?
The whole of my formative years. Not only my education. I was at a little church school, one of the elementary schools created by the Act in 1902, leaving school at 14. I failed the scholarship because by that time they'd introduced secondary schools to which you either paid a small fee, which my father would not, or you took a scholarship for about 20% of the places. And I failed the scholarship. Similar to the 11 plus actually today. And so I went on until I was 14, but I left school to earn my living. 14, time to earn a living in those days. Wasn't much of a living I earned, I can tell you. But I became a shop assistant.
And was that in Brighton?
In Brighton, in Western Road.
And what kind of shop was it?
What they call a drapery store, selling all sorts of things, whether furniture, soft furnishing, clothing, that sort of thing. And I became an apprentice shop assistant for £0.50 a week, 2 shillings and sixpence, 12.5p in today's money. But they said, you're not really entitled to anything. We're training you. You're an apprentice. But we'll give you just this little token amount, £0.50.
So you took an exam to go to secondary school, to get a scholarship to secondary school, but you didn't pass.
Exactly.
How did that make you feel then?
I try to think back. I don't think it quite had the devastating effect that I know in the case of many young people, the failure of the 11 plus has. Because I had so many friends there, I think I'd have been sorry to leave them. And the teacher we had there I was lucky, quite remarkable. The fact that I can speak to you now so fluently, I put down to his teaching. Of course, he wasn't interested in anything else but the language. Every aspect of the language, whether it was writing it, or acting, or debating, anything to do with the language, writing poetry, he was very keen on. He was himself a marvellous actor, but nothing else. I mean, he knew pretty nearly nothing about geography or history. In fact, he gave us geography as a punishment when we were naughty.
And did you have a favourite subject at school?
English, of course,
Right.
and acting.
And acting. And did that teacher have an impact on you, do you think? In terms of, you know, did that teacher have an influence on what you did later in life?
Oh, absolutely. There's not the slightest doubt that as things stand at the moment, I think I'm pretty good at talking or anything connected with the language, but not very much else.
So you went to work in the draper's shop, you became an apprentice, but what happened next? Did you
we left Brighton.
Right.
We left Brighton in my 16th year, before my 16th birthday, and I got a similar job in the West End of London, in Regent Street, a large Irish linen store called Robinson and Cleaver's. And I stayed with them for some time. Then I became a commercial traveller for a sweet firm which everybody knows, Mars Confections. And then I became a door-to-door canvasser, and then I was conscripted for 6 years. The British Army took me to India, Burma, Malaya, and when I came out, this wonderful opportunity to become a teacher. You didn't have to have any of the usual formal qualifications, which suited me. You had to go in for you had an interview. Well, as perhaps you can guess, I'm quite good at interviews. And I got in and became a teacher, which I did for the rest of my working life.
Fantastic. So
And much enjoyed too, despite the strains and stresses.
So this was the time of the post-war Labour government.
That's right.
The setting up of the National Health Service.
That's right.
And of course the 1944 Education Act.
Absolutely.
So tell us about that and what that meant to people at the time.
Well now, the 1944 Education Act has to be seen as part of a historical development of state education. You see, you have to ask, what is state education for? And by state education, I'm distinguishing it from education in general, because there may be two somewhat slightly different purposes. You started with the 1870 Act, of course, when they needed some literate workers, so because the Industrial Revolution has made us the foremost country in Europe, and we needed literate workers, so from 5 to 10, instead of going into the factories and down coal mines, the children were sent to school, to board school. But by 1902, they needed people with a few people with a little bit better qualifications, so they introduced the board schools became elementary schools under local education authorities, And they also had set up for the first time state secondary schools. You had to pay a small fee for those, which my father wouldn't do, or pass a scholarship, very similar to the 11 plus, which is, I think I said before, I failed. And then, of course, during the war, when there was all this talk of a wonderful welfare state after the war, 1944, you got the Education Act abolishing elementary education, secondary education for all. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But with this little catch. Different types of secondary education. You were going to have a few going on to technical, secondary technical schools, but we can forget those for the moment. They were not so important. The majority going to secondary modern schools, simply a new name for the elementary schools, and the same 20% going to secondary grammar schools, which were the old secondary schools. It's all based on the apparent needs of society. That's why the 1870 Act, they needed illiterate workers. The 1902 Act, they needed a little bit more than literate, and so on, right the way through. And when we get to the 1944 Act, there was this famous remark that the secondary modern schools are for the future hewers of wood and drawers of water. In other words, at 11, your whole life's career was set based on the information they obtained, a test you took, basically the intelligence test, where those that filled in the noughts and crosses, as I call it, more successfully, small 20% the elite, went to the secondary grammar schools. The rest, as I say, they can go and, sorry, Sonny, but you can't, you know. Now just imagine a teacher faced with a whole class of kids who've been told that they can't. How are you going to motivate them to believe that they can?
So you're a teacher by now,
yeah.
And you're teaching in this system.
Yeah.
What kind of school were you teaching in?
Well, in my first job was in what was called a central school, a rather unusual one in London. And I was there for some considerable time. And these are the ones who had just failed the 11 plus. So we were able to give them a kind of semi-grammar school education. We got some pretty good exam results. And then I went abroad to Germany and lectured at the university in Germany. And when I came back, came to Brighton and went to Dorothy Stringer School, which was a secondary modern school. And I've written about it in my poem, which I shall read later. The whole point was that you had, first of all, to get hold of those children, and you had to absolutely convince them, and it wasn't easy, having failed the 11 plus, that they could if they would. If they really wanted to, they could do just as well as the kids who passed the 11 plus. And it's very difficult to make them believe that. After all, some officials had told them they couldn't. And this is why my dislike of the selective system really burgeoned. I mean, I felt that the arrogance of saying that you know what a person's whole intellectual development is going to be. You know, Professor Himmelwhite did a study in London, 500 children at the age of 11, all from various different parts of London, and therefore under different educational authorities, with different, and this is another key factor, each educational authority has a different number of grammar school places. They haven't all got the same proportion of grammar. So what she discovered is that people who got the same intelligence quotient, as it was called, in one borough went to grammar school. People with the same intelligence quotient in a different borough, they went to secondary modern because there weren't enough grammar school places. How can that possibly be justified? But she then went on to trace the career of all those 500 right until their 25th birthday. And she discovered that those with exactly the same intelligence quotient who'd gone to grammar school did far better in life than those who'd gone to secondary school. Do you need any further proof than that of the fallacy of the whole thing? And when I came to Brighton, back from Germany where I was lecturing, knowing that there were comprehensive schools in various parts, and I found to my utter alarm, not only were they still the selective system in Brighton, but even teachers who should know better were talking about, those factory schools, which is what they call the comprehensive. And a group of us set up a comprehensive schools campaign. And there was one university professor, another university doctor, there was Stanley Deason, the well-known local councillor, and several others. 8 years we ran that campaign, and eventually a Conservative council introduced comprehensive schools in Brighton.
So what year was that you finally
This would be round about 1970, would it be? Something like that. Yes. I think they were eventually, a comprehensive system was introduced in the 70s or the early 70s. And the school I was in, it was a secondary modern school, became comprehensive. And we were told, mixing the dullards with the bright ones will hold back the bright ones. Well, they held back. I was in charge of the history department, head of history, and I took them for their 16 plus exam, and I had them completely mixed. Those who come from, it was stream, but those who came up to me, they all came all together. And the bright ones were so badly held back that several of them won university scholarships, and a large number of them went to university.
And did it make a difference to the atmosphere in the school and the ethos of the school when the school became
completely, obviously transformed. They still had streaming, of course, and that's still, to some extent, contentious. Some comprehensive schools abolished streaming, certainly in the early years, introduced it later before the exams. Yes, it's a completely different attitude. But of course we knew, and I warned them at the time, said the educational reactionaries, the elitists, they will come back, they will fight to reintroduce it. Exactly what you've got now. Don't accept all this propaganda about poor results of comprehensive schools. Even on their very narrow assessment of achievement, which is passing of exams, of course, the comprehensive schools have done far better than the divided system. I mean, you had 20%, and they didn't all pass the 16 plus exam. Now, if a comprehensive school only has 30% passes, a terrible failure, which of course is a nonsense. They are a roaring success, even those that are rated as less good schools. A roaring success.